Okay, so are you ready to dive into something really cool today? We're going to be talking about orthodontics.
But not like the usual stuff.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about how your jaw develops and like how important it is for your whole face, not just like having straight teeth.
And that's where this Dr. Carlos Barberi comes in. His lecture is our source material this time. And let me tell you, he's got some really interesting ideas about how we diagnose problems with the jaw.
Because it's not just as easy as saying, oh, you have an overbite or an underbite, is it?
Nope, not even close. Barberi says those like classifications, class 1, 2, 3, they're way too simplified. Like he uses this phrase, a trapped mandible.
Trapped mandible. Okay, now that sounds serious.
Right. Imagine your lower jaw is basically stuck. It can't fully grow, right? Because the upper jaw is too narrow.
So what causes that?
Honestly, it could be a bunch of things. Sometimes it's your genes. Sometimes it's like bad habits, like if you breathe through your mouth a lot or a thumbsucker. Barberi's big thing is that it's never just one thing. It's like this whole chain reaction.
Like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One thing being off can mess up the whole system.
Exactly. So he says to really get what's going on, we got to look at the bigger picture,
Yeah.
literally. Like he breaks down facial development into 6 different planes of analysis.
6 planes. Okay, I think you're going to have to explain that one.
Okay, so think about 3 dimensions, right? Like height, width, depth. Now think about your dental arches. So that's like the size of your upper and lower teeth. Then you take those same 3 dimensions, but you think about how your upper jaw, maxilla, and your lower jaw, the mandible, how they relate to each other in space.
So it's not just the size of each jaw by itself, but how they actually fit together in like our 3D world.
You got it. And get this, Barberi uses specific measurements to figure this out. Like he talks about how the distance between your molars should be 34 millimeters, ideally. He says even being off by a little bit in any of these planes, it can cause a domino effect and lead to problems with your bite, how your face looks, even how you breathe.
Wow, 34 millimeters. Who knew something that small could be so important?
It's wild, right? It just shows how everything in the face is connected. It's like building a house.
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
You need the rooms to be the right size, yeah. But they also got to fit together the right way or the whole house is messed up.
That's such a good analogy. So with these 6 planes, is Barberi saying that even if one of them is off, it can like throw off the balance of your whole face?
That's exactly it. And it gets even more interesting. He uses this word concatenated to describe how all these 6 planes affect one another.
Concatenated. Okay, I'll be honest. I've never heard that word before in my life. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means they're all linked together, like they're chained to each other. It's not just that these planes exist separately, it's that they're constantly like interacting, one affects the other, and so on. Barberi is saying that growth, like how our faces grow, it's not just random, it's like this super intricate dance.
So less about each bone doing its own thing and more about how they all grow in relation to each other.
Now you're getting it. And this is where he starts to challenge how orthodontists usually think about things. He's basically saying if you just slap some braces on and try to move teeth without thinking about the bigger picture,
You might not be fixing the real problem.
bingo. And this is where that trapped mandible idea gets really interesting.
So if someone's got a trapped mandible, what does that actually look like? Like, how can you tell?
Well, they might have like a receding chin, and the lower jaw overall might just look smaller. Maybe their bite seems a bit off. But the important thing is figuring out what's causing it.
And that's where those 6 planes of analysis come in.
Exactly. Barberi would say you can't just look at one measurement or like one thing about their face. You got to look at all those planes, how they all work together. Remember how we were talking about the distance between molars should be 34 millimeters?
Yeah.
If the upper jaw is too narrow, that measurement's going to be off, and that can set off that chain reaction, It starts affecting how the lower jaw grows too.
It all comes back to that domino effect.
Oh.
Everything is connected.
It really is. And here's where it gets even cooler. Barberi says it's not even just about the bones themselves. He says how we use our jaws and faces, the function, that affects growth too.
What do you mean by function? Like how we chew?
Yeah. Chewing, swallowing, even how you breathe. He says all those things create forces that literally shape the jaw as it grows. Like he uses this example of if you have a narrow palate, which can happen if you breathe through your mouth a lot, it can change the position of your tongue. And then that messes with how the whole lower face develops.
I never thought about it like that. You mean like our everyday habits could actually be changing the shape of our bones?
It's pretty amazing. And that's why Barberi thinks some of the traditional ways orthodontists do things, it's not getting to the root of the problem. He says trying to fix a bite with just braces without thinking about these other things, It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
So it's not enough to just move the teeth around. You got to figure out why the jaw is growing differently in the first place.
Exactly. And sometimes that means figuring out if someone's a mouth breather or even just how they position their tongue.
This is all so interesting. But if a trapped mandible is like this whole interconnected thing, how do you even start to fix it?
Well, Barberi is a big believer in catching things early. He says while the bones are still growing, like in kids, you've got a much better chance of influencing how they develop.
So if we're talking about kids, not adults who want to like change their
Yeah.
jawline.
Ideally, yeah. I mean, there are things you can do later in life, but when you're still growing, that's the sweet spot. Barberi talks about using special appliances that not only move the teeth, but they can actually help expand the palate, like make the upper jaw wider. And that can guide the jawbones to grow the right way.
So it's less about forcing teeth into a certain position and more about creating the right environment for the jaw to grow properly.
Exactly. And that's why this whole thing is so cool. It's like Barberi's saying we need to take a much more holistic view in orthodontics. He wants dentists and orthodontists to think about the whole picture, not just the teeth, the airway, the muscles, how everything functions together.
Because if you're just looking at the teeth, you're missing a huge part of the story.
You got it. The face is complicated. And to treat it properly, we got to understand all the pieces of the puzzle and how they fit together.
And this is where Barberi throws in something really interesting. He starts talking about how everyone is different, and what's normal for one person's face might not be normal for someone else.
Right. Like what we think is a good or bad facial feature, that's often just cultural. What looks good to one person might not look so good to someone else, depending on where they're from or what they're used to.
So are you saying there's no such thing as like a perfect bite or a perfect jawline?
Well, that's what Barberi is getting at, and it's a really important thing to consider. He doesn't, go into tons of detail in this lecture, but he definitely thinks we need to rethink what we consider ideal when it comes to faces.
What do you mean rethink? Like, what we think is a good jawline is different from what's actually healthy.
Well, yeah, think about it. What's considered a nice face, it's different everywhere you go, right? Like
Yeah.
cultural standards of beauty and all that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, what someone in one culture thinks is attractive could be totally different somewhere else.
Exactly. And Barberi is suggesting that maybe those ideas about what's attractive, they don't always match up with what's actually best for someone's health. Like, what if your idea of a perfect jawline actually makes it harder to breathe?
Yeah.
So he's saying we need to be more nuanced, look at each person as an individual.
So instead of trying to make everyone fit this one ideal, it's more about figuring out what's best for that person's face and their body.
Exactly. And this all ties back into what we were talking about before, those 6 planes of analysis, how we use our jaws and faces, catching things early in kids. It's all about taking a more holistic view, looking at the whole picture, not just using braces to make everyone look the same.
So it's like personalized orthodontics.
There you go. And that's a big deal because it changes how we think about diagnosing problems and treating them. It means we can't just look at the teeth. We got to consider everything, the airway, those muscles we talked about, how the whole system works together. And yeah, even a person's unique features and how their face is growing.
So if there's no one ideal for everyone, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is just realizing that this stuff is complicated.
Yeah.
Facial development, how our jaws grow. It's not simple. It's not just about having straight teeth. There's a lot going on, and understanding that can make a huge difference for people's health.
It's like we're seeing the face in a whole new way.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this stuff so cool, right? Like we got to keep asking questions, challenging what we think we know, and being open to new ideas. Dr. Barberi is really pushing us to think differently and appreciate how amazing and unique every face is.
It's so true. Sometimes the most interesting stuff comes up when we start questioning what we think we already know.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we're going to leave you with this. What if embracing all the different ways our faces grow and develop is actually the key to better health and function for everyone? That's something to think about.